The notice wasn't even in an envelope. It was just a single sheet of paper, folded once, slipped under my door sometime between midnight and 6 in the morning, and when I picked it up and read the words, "Notice to vacate," my first thought wasn't panic. It was almost calm. Like some part of me had known this was coming for a long time and had simply been waiting for the paperwork to make it official. 5 days. That was what I had left. My name is Caleb. Wait, no. Let me start over. Because even now, almost 3 years later, I still have to remind myself that what happens next was real. My name is Oliver Pace, and 5 days before I was supposed to hand over the keys to the only apartment I had rented on my own in my 28 years on this earth, a 71-year-old woman named Beverly Crane knocked on my door and offered me something that had nothing to do with money. And somehow, that was exactly what saved me. I had moved to Cincinnati, Ohio from a small town in eastern Kentucky when I was 24, chasing the idea that a bigger city meant bigger chances. For a while, I was right. I got a job at a mid-sized logistics company downtown, coordinating freight routes. Nothing exciting but steady. Good enough for a one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building on Ludlow Avenue in Clifton. Good enough to feel like I had figured something out about adulthood that I had spent years being afraid of. Then 14 months ago, the company lost a major contract and cut 1/3 of its workforce in a single afternoon. My manager called me into his office at 7 on a Thursday. By 3:15, I was carrying a cardboard box through the lobby, and by 3:30, I was sitting in my car in the parking garage, not really sure where to drive. What followed was the kind of slow-motion collapse that you don't fully understand while it's happening. It only makes sense in hindsight when you can line up all the decisions and see how each one led naturally to the next. I told myself I'd find something within a month, then 2 months. I cut back on groceries, then streaming services, then the gym membership. I borrowed $200 from my college roommate and promised to pay it back the following week. I didn't pay it back. He stopped texting after a while, which in some ways was worse than being confronted about it. By month 4, I was 3 months behind on rent. My landlord at the time, a property management company with a corporate name and a generic email address, sent automated reminders that felt like they were written by a robot that had never once worried about anything. I applied to everything I could find. Dispatch coordinator positions, warehouse supervisor roles, driving jobs. Administrative work I had no real experience in but figured I could learn. Some applications disappeared without acknowledgement. Others led to phone screens that went nowhere. One interview went genuinely well, I thought, and then the hiring manager sent me an email 4 days later that began with "after careful consideration," and I didn't finish reading it. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday. I picked it up off the floor, unfolded it, and read it standing there in my socks in the narrow entryway of an apartment that had started to feel like a room I was just borrowing from my own future, not actually living in. 5 days. I had 5 days to either come up with 4 months of back rent or vacate the premises. If any part of this story speaks to something you've felt yourself, or if you believe in the kind of unexpected grace that can arrive when everything else has run out, I'd ask you to take a moment right now to like this video, share it with someone who might need it today, leave a comment, and subscribe to Mercy Stories. Because what happened to me in those 5 days is something I'm still trying to fully understand, even now. The apartment was quiet that night in a way I had stopped noticing until that moment. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere below me, a television murmured through the floor. I sat down on the couch and didn't turn on any lights. Just sat there while the room went from gray to dark around me. I had enough money for maybe 6 days of food if I was careful. I had a cousin in Lexington who had already offered once for me to come crash with her, and I had said no because saying yes felt like something you couldn't take back. Like admitting that Cincinnati hadn't worked, that I hadn't worked, that the version of myself I'd been trying to build for 4 years was something I'd imagined rather than earned. By day 2, I started making a mental list of everything I'd need to do to move. Called the cousin, figure out storage for the furniture, cancel the utilities, notify the post office. The list was practical and it was horrible, and every item on it felt like a small confirmation of something I didn't want to confirm. Day 3, I walked to the laundromat 2 blocks away because I had been putting off doing laundry for almost 2 weeks. I sat next to a dryer watching my clothes tumble, and I thought about calling my mom, but I didn't know how to explain it. She had worked night shifts at a hospital for 15 years to help me get through college, and the idea of telling her I was about to be evicted felt like a kind of betrayal I wasn't ready to commit. Day 4 was when I started packing, not because I had decided to leave, exactly, more because the body sometimes does what the mind refuses to admit it needs to do. I broke down a few boxes I'd saved from a delivery and started filling them with books, kitchen things, the few framed photos I had on the windowsill. I worked slowly, not rushing, the way you move when you're doing something you haven't fully accepted yet. I was taping the second box shut when I heard a knock at my door. It was soft, almost apologetic in its softness, the kind of knock that seems uncertain whether it wants to be answered. I set down the tape and went to the door and opened it. Beverly Crane was standing in the hallway. I had seen Beverly a handful of times since I moved in. She lived in the apartment directly across the hall, number 3B, and she had the kind of quiet, contained presence that makes certain people nearly invisible in a building full of strangers. She was in her early 70s, small-framed, with silver hair cut close to her head, and reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead even when she wasn't reading. She always carried a canvas tote bag when she left the building, always held the elevator door if she saw you coming, and occasionally left a small plate of something, cookies at Christmas, once a square of cornbread wrapped in foil, outside her neighbor's doors without a note. I did not know her name when she knocked. I had to learn it later. She looked at me for a moment, and then her eyes moved briefly past me to the open boxes on the floor, the bare shelves, the coat I had draped over the back of the couch because I hadn't had energy to hang it up in 3 days. She didn't say anything about any of that. She just looked back at me and said very simply, "I wonder if you have a few minutes." I told her I did. She asked if she could come in. I said yes. She stepped inside and I closed the door behind her and we stood in my half-packed apartment with the overhead light on, which felt suddenly very bright. She looked around once more, not intrusively, just taking things in, and then she looked at me the way certain older people do, like they're reading something in your face that you've been trying to keep off of it. "I know about the notice," she said. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't my landlord. The notice hadn't come small, and she was the kind of person who paid attention to things. "I saw them slide it under your door 2 nights ago," she said. "I happened to be awake. I'm always awake at strange hours." She paused. I wasn't trying to pry. I just saw it, and I've been thinking about it ever since. I told her it was fine, that I was handling it, which was not exactly true, but it was what you say. She nodded once and then she said, "I'm not here to offer you money. I want to be clear about that up front, because I don't think that's what either of us needs from this conversation." She reached up and took her reading glasses off her forehead and held them in both hands, turning them slowly. "What I'd like to offer you is something different, and I want you to hear me out before you say anything." I said, "Okay." What Beverly told me over the next 20 minutes rearranged everything I thought I understood about what was happening to me. She had lived in apartment 3B for 11 years. Before that, she had lived in Hyde Park, in a house she and her late husband had bought in 1987. Her husband, a man named Donald, had died 6 years ago. They had one son who lived in Phoenix and called every Sunday but had his own life, his own kids, his own calendar full of things. Beverly had stayed in Cincinnati because it was home, because she knew the streets and the coffee shops and the faces at her church, and because she was, she told me, not the kind of person who moved toward things so much as the kind of person who stayed close to what she already understood. But in the last several months, she had been making plans to leave. Not because she wanted to, because her doctor had told her in the bluntest terms possible that she needed to stop living alone. She had a heart condition that had worsened over the past year, and her son Phoenix's had been pushing her toward an assisted living community near him that had good reviews and a waiting list she was now on. She was scheduled to move in 63 days, and her apartment, she said, was full of a lifetime of things she needed to go through, organize, donate, or pack, and she had been dreading it for months because she had no idea how to do it alone, and her son could only fly in for one weekend, and the friends who might have helped were either gone or not well themselves. She needed someone, she said, not a professional company, not strangers in a moving truck who'd show up for 3 hours and handle everything like cargo. She needed someone who would sit with her while she went through 40 years of accumulated life and help her decide what mattered and what could go. Someone who would actually be present for it. She had been trying to figure out how to ask a neighbor for weeks and kept talking herself out of it. Until she saw that notice slide under my door. "I can't pay you much," she said, "but I can pay your back rent." She said it carefully, like she had rehearsed it. All of it, in exchange for your time over the next 2 months. Every day if you're willing, or whenever you can. We go through the apartment together. You help me figure out what stays and what goes. You help me pack what matters." She paused. "And I'd like your company. I'm not going to pretend that's not part of it, too." I didn't say anything for a long time. I think I expected, in the way you expect things when you've been living in anxiety for months, that there would be a catch. That she'd mention something that would make the offer complicated or strange or impossible. But she just stood there with her reading glasses in her hands, looking at me with the calm of someone who had already thought this through from every angle and decided it was the right thing to do. Finally, I asked her why me. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "You held the elevator for me last winter when you didn't have to. You were already late. I could tell from how you were dressed, coat half on, bag over one shoulder, but you held it anyway and you didn't look impatient while you waited. I noticed that." She put her glasses back on her forehead. "I've been watching people for 71 years. You notice things." I said I would do it. I don't know exactly what I expected the next few weeks to feel like. Probably something awkward, or strained, or heavy with obligation on both sides. What I did not expect was that going through Beverly's apartment would become, quietly and without announcement, the thing that pulled me back to myself. We started the following morning. Beverly made coffee. Real coffee, not the instant kind I'd been living on. And we sat at her kitchen table for a few minutes before we began, the way you might before starting something that deserves a small moment of acknowledgement. Then she took me into the back bedroom, which had been used for storage since Donald died, and opened the door, and I understood immediately why she'd needed help. There were boxes stacked to shoulder height along 2 walls, a closet so full the door barely shut, shelves of books, of binders, of labeled bins, whose labels had faded or been applied to the wrong containers years ago, rolled-up area rugs, Donald's winter coats, still hanging on a rod inside a garment bag. "I haven't been able to open this door in 2 years, Beverly said. She said it simply, without self-pity. We started with the books because Beverly said books were the easiest to make decisions about, and I think she needed an easy place to start. She pulled them off the shelves one at a time, and I sat cross-legged on the floor and she handed them to me or kept them. And when she kept them, she often told me why. A novel she'd read on her honeymoon. A bird identification guide Donald had bought thinking he'd take up birdwatching and never did. A collection of poetry her mother had given her at some point she couldn't quite place, but that had stayed with her through 7 moves. I didn't need to say much. What she needed, I started to understand, was a witness. Someone present while she went through the process of deciding what she was taking with her into the next part of her life. Some afternoons were heavy. She found a box of Donald's papers, warranty cards for appliances they no longer owned, instruction manuals for things she couldn't identify, a handful of letters he'd saved that she read quietly before folding back up and putting in a pile she labeled, "Keep." She didn't cry in front of me, but once or twice I came back into the room from getting water and found her sitting very still with something in her hands, and I learned to take a little longer in the kitchen on those days. Other afternoons were lighter than I expected. Beverly had an incredibly dry sense of humor that surfaced at unexpected moments. She held up a ceramic rooster from the back of a shelf one afternoon and said, completely deadpan, "I have no memory of this rooster. I have no idea where this rooster came from, and yet here it is in my home as if it has always lived here." She looked at me over her glasses. "I believe the rooster goes." By the 3rd week, we had fallen into a rhythm. I arrived by 9. Beverly had coffee waiting. We worked until noon, broke for lunch. She cooked, insisted on it, and she was genuinely good. The kind of home cooking that tastes like it took much longer than it did, and then worked again until 3 or 4 in the afternoon. Some days we didn't talk much. Other days we talked the entire time, about everything and nothing. She asked me about Kentucky, about my family, about what I had wanted to be before I figured out what I could actually do for money. I told her things I hadn't thought about in years. She told me about the early years of her marriage, the apartment she and Donald had rented when they first moved to Cincinnati, how they had eaten cereal for dinner more nights than she could count, and hadn't minded because they were too young and too happy to mind. She told me about her son's first day of school, the color of the jacket he wore, how he'd tried very hard not to look nervous and hadn't quite managed it. I stopped thinking about the eviction after about a week, not because the situation was resolved. It wasn't, not officially, but because I had somewhere to be each morning, something that needed to be done, and someone who was counting on me in a way that was quiet and honest and real. That turned out to matter more than I had realized it could. About 5 weeks in, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. And I want to tell you about it honestly because it's part of the story, and because leaving it out would make everything else seem easier than it was. Beverly's son flew in from Phoenix for the weekend he had promised. His name was Greg. He was in his mid-40s, efficient in the way of people who spend their professional lives managing things, and when he walked into Beverly's apartment and saw the progress we'd made, the sorted boxes, the labeled donations, the clear floor, where there had been no clear floor for 2 years, his first response was not gratitude. He pulled Beverly aside while I was in the back bedroom, and I could hear, though not the words, the tone of what he was saying. Careful. Concerned. Slightly clipped. Beverly came to find me a few minutes later. She said, without elaborating, that Greg had some questions and that she wanted me to come out and meet him properly. I came out and we shook hands, and Greg looked at me with the particular expression of someone running a quiet calculation. He asked, politely but directly, how Beverly and I had come to this arrangement. I told him. He listened without expression. Then he asked who had suggested the rent payment as compensation, and I said Beverly had, and he nodded slowly in the way of someone storing a piece of information for later. That night, after Greg and Beverly had gone to dinner, I sat in my own apartment and felt, for the first time in weeks, the familiar weight of uncertainty settling back in. I thought about how the arrangement would look to someone on the outside. An old woman living alone, a young man in financial trouble, an exchange involving money. I understood why Greg was worried. I just didn't know how to prove that what Beverly and I had built over those 5 weeks was something different from what it looked like to someone seeing it for the first time. The next morning, Beverly knocked on my door before I came over. She was carrying 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to me through the doorway and said, without preamble, "I've spoken with Greg. He's satisfied. He asked me several questions that were somewhat intrusive, and I answered them all, and he is satisfied." She looked at me steadily. "I am 71 years old, and I have been making my own decisions since before Greg was born, and I will continue to do so. I just wanted you to hear that from me directly." I didn't say anything. I just took the coffee. We went back to work. The last few weeks moved faster. There's something about the end of a big project that accelerates time. Some shift in the air when you can see the finish from where you're standing. The storage room was almost clear. The donations had been picked up twice by a local organization that Beverly had chosen specifically because she had volunteered there briefly in the early 90s and trusted them. The boxes going to Phoenix were stacked neatly by the front door, labeled in Beverly's handwriting, which was small and precise and looked like it belonged on something important. 3 days before Beverly's moving date, a man named Patrick Hensley stopped by the apartment. He was one of Beverly's oldest friends, someone she had known since before Donald, from a church group decades ago. He was in his late 60s, stocky, with the easy warmth of someone who had spent years in rooms full of people and genuinely liked it there. He had come to help Beverly carry some things down to the storage unit in the building's basement, and he stayed for about an hour. While Beverly was on the phone with the moving company, Patrick and I stood in the hallway outside her door, and somehow we started talking about work. I don't remember who brought it up first. He asked what I did, and I told him what I had done and what had happened to the job, and he listened in the way people sometimes listen when they're also processing something else. He ran a small transportation consulting firm, he said. Not large, maybe 12 people, mostly contract work, helping mid-size companies optimize their distribution networks. And he had been looking, he mentioned, almost like an aside, almost like he wasn't sure whether to say it, for someone with hands-on freight logistics experience to come in at a coordinator level and help manage a few accounts that had recently grown more complex than his current team was set up to handle. He looked at me when he said it. Not pointedly. Just, he looked at me. I told him about my background at the old company, the specific systems I knew, the types of freight, the geographic lanes I'd worked. He asked a few questions, precise ones, the kind that come from someone who actually understands what they're asking about. He told me to come by his office the following week. I remember walking back into my own apartment that evening and standing in the kitchen for a moment, not doing anything, just standing. The apartment felt different than it had 5 weeks ago, less like a room I was about to lose and more like a place I actually lived. There were groceries in the refrigerator. There was a plant on the windowsill that Beverly had given me from her own collection when she realized she couldn't take everything to Phoenix. A small succulent in a ceramic pot, very much alive. I went to Patrick Hensley's office the following Tuesday. The interview was 90 minutes. He introduced me to two of his other staff members, showed me the office, walked me through the accounts in question. At the end, he asked me when I could start. I started the following Monday. Beverly moved to Phoenix on a Thursday morning in early March. The moving truck came at 8 and was done by 11, which felt too fast for something that had taken 11 years to accumulate. I helped carry the last few boxes down. Her apartment, 3B, was empty by noon, and I stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the bare walls and the clean carpet and the marks on the windowsill where her plants had sat. Beverly hugged me in the hallway before she left. She held on for a moment, which surprised me, because in all the weeks we had worked together, she had not been particularly demonstrative, more of a hand-on-the-arm person than a hugger. But she held on for a moment, and then she stepped back and looked at me and said, "You didn't need saving as much as you thought you did. You just needed somewhere to put your energy until the right door opened." I didn't have anything to say to that. I just nodded. I still text her. Every couple of weeks, sometimes more. She sends me photos from her community in Phoenix. The courtyard, her new neighbors, once a photo of a hummingbird feeder outside her window that had attracted what she described, in the text, as an unreasonable number of hummingbirds. She seems genuinely okay. More than okay. The position at Patrick's firm turned into a full-time role with benefits by the end of my 3rd month. I'm still there now. The work is harder than what I did before, more complex, and I'm learning things I didn't know I needed to learn, which is a particular kind of satisfaction I hadn't felt in a long time. The apartment on Ludlow Avenue is still mine. Different lease now, different terms, everything current. I painted the entryway last fall, a dark blue-green that Beverly, when I sent her a photo, described as unexpectedly brave for someone who used to have beige walls. I put the succulent on the windowsill, and it has somehow, against what I would have predicted about my ability to keep things alive, continued to grow. Before I get to the end of this, I want to ask you something. In the comments below, tell me where you're watching from and about a time someone helped you in a way you didn't expect. Not necessarily something dramatic. It doesn't have to be a big story. Sometimes the small ones say more. I read every one of them. I've thought a lot about why any of this happened the way it did. There's a version of the story where Beverly doesn't see the notice slide under my door. Or she sees it and decides it isn't her business. Or I answer the door that afternoon and say I'm fine thanks and close it again, and the story goes a completely different direction. Every day I'm aware of how many small things had to land exactly right. What I know is this: Beverly Crane did not fix my life. She didn't hand me a solution. She handed me a morning to be somewhere and a reason to get up and a cup of good coffee and her trust, which was not a small thing to give a stranger you'd only really noticed holding an elevator once in winter. And that was enough. It turned out that was exactly enough. 2 months from a vacate notice to a job offer. I still have the original notice somewhere. I kept it, folded in the same fold it arrived in, not as a reminder of the worst part, but as a reminder of the Tuesday afternoon that Beverly Crane knocked softly on my door and offered me something I didn't know I needed. I didn't know. I'd been lucky enough to live across the hall from. If this story meant something to you, please like the video and share it with someone who might be carrying something heavy right now and could use a reminder that the door that opens next is sometimes the one you'd least expect. Subscribe to Mercy Stories for more, because sometimes the person standing closest to your worst moment is also the one who shows you the way out. Not by pulling you forward, but by simply being steady enough that you can find your footing again.